Before we start today, we'd like to thank Crocs for sponsoring us. Come as you are.
Hi, my name is Addison Dempsey, and this is Machine Politics. This episode is called The Effect of War on Presidential Elections. We were curious about the effect of war on politics and how voters will generally behave during periods of political and economic upheaval. That means voter turnout during election results, campaign strategies, and more. We do want to acknowledge this will likely be an oversimplification of this period of history, but we thought a focus on the two world wars were some of the most important events to the vast population of the United States at the time, and therefore decided to focus on those wars mainly. We're going to be focusing on 7 major elections: the election before, during, and after World War I, and the elections before, during, and after World War II. World War I was called the war to end all wars, but as we will later see, it was not. American involvement in World War I started in 1917, but the conflict had been at the front of American minds since it started in 1914. The elections we'll be focusing on today are the elections of 1912, 1916, and 1920. The election of 1912. This election was 2 years before World War I would begin. The candidates were Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat, Theodore Roosevelt, a progressive, William H. Taft, a Republican, and Eugene Debs, a socialist. The Democratic campaign was economically focused, looking at tariff reduction, banking reform, restricting monopolies, and more strict antitrust laws. These progressive reforms were called the New Freedom Plan. The Republican Party was extremely divided. Republican insurgents were rising in number, and they were dissatisfied with Taft, causing a split in the party. Taft ended up with 8 electoral votes, the worst performance by a presidential incumbent seeking re-election ever. The Progressive campaign touted their progressive reform credentials: women's suffrage, tariff reduction, control of big business, and tax reform. The campaign was a split off of the Republican Party. The winner of this election was President Woodrow Wilson and Vice President Thomas R. Marshall. The voter turnout for this election was 58.8% of the voting age population. The next election we'll be focusing on is the election of 1916. The candidates in this election were Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, Charles E. Hughes, a Republican, and Allen Benson, a socialist. The Democratic campaign focused mainly on neutrality in World War I, using statements like "He kept us out of the war" and "America first." The Democratic campaign relied on his good record of good administration in his previous term. They distributed a lot of campaign literature and had surrogates give speeches all around the U.S. The Republican campaign was more unified after the Bull Moose Party split. Hughes ran a very active campaign. He criticized Wilson for not taking the necessary precautions in case America joined the war. Public opinion was very anti-war at the time, so this backfired. Hughes refused to try to get any progressive votes. This led to the winner being President Woodrow Wilson and Vice President Thomas R. Marshall. Voter turnout in this election was 61.6% of the voting age population. This was a rise of almost 3% from the previous presidential election. The United States would enter World War I the year after this election. The election of 1920 saw James M. Cox, a Democrat, running against Warren G. Harding, a Republican, and Eugene Debs, a socialist. The Democratic campaign was at a disadvantage because people were dissatisfied with Woodrow Wilson's previous term. He went back on his promise to keep America out of World War I and didn't involve Congress in the Treaty of Versailles. He also refused to compromise with Republicans about joining the League of Nations. The party was also divided over prohibition. They advocated for membership with the League of Nations. They did not correctly parse the mood of the nation. People were exhausted and disillusioned, and the Democratic Party wanted to go full speed into reparations and growth post-war. The Republican campaign, on the other hand, promised a return to normalcy. They promised to lower taxes, limit immigration, and reject membership in the League of Nations. They also criticized Wilson's handling of the war. Warren G. Harding is quoted as saying, "America's present need is not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy, not revolution, but restoration, not surgery, but serenity. People found his bland message comforting at the time. The winner of this election was President Warren G. Harding and Vice President Calvin Coolidge, the Republican candidates. Voter turnout for this election was 49.2%. This is a decrease of over 10% from the previous election. This was likely because of public apathy after the war ended in 1918.
Our second sponsor today is the Anti-Croc Coalition. Do you wear Crocs? If so, you are an irredeemable fascist who needs to be immediately captured and rehabilitated like a diseased street dog. If you or a loved one struggle with pro-Croc attraction, please visit the Anti-Croc Coalition's offices anywhere on Radford campus, and you will be helped as soon as possible. You are stronger than your addiction.
Next, we go on to World War II. We will focus on the elections of 1936, 1940, 1944, and 1948. The first election we'll focus on is 1936. This saw Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt running against Republican Alfred M. Landon. The Democratic campaign was focused on Roosevelt running for re-election. Although he had been heavily criticized for some of the decisions during his previous term, he had the support of farm workers, laborers, and the poor. The Democratic Party was unified and strongly in support of Roosevelt. The Republican campaign was divided after a fairly devastating loss in 1932. The campaign itself was more anti-Roosevelt than it was pro-Republican. Landon focused heavily on public criticism of Roosevelt's policies rather than his own plans of action. This only served to bond the Democratic Party tighter, and the race didn't end up being very competitive. The winner of this election was President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Vice President John Nance Garner. Voter turnout for this election was 56.9% of the voting age population. The election of 1940 is the next election we'll be looking at. This saw, again, Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat, running against Wendell L. Willkie, a Republican. On the Democratic side, Roosevelt wasn't going to run for re-election. He would be breaking the two-term limit established by George Washington. But as World War II intensified and it seemed like the U.S. might need to get involved, he changed his mind and decided to run. He was pretty much the only viable Democratic option for a presidential nominee at the time. He favored a vigilant national defense system and provision of European aid, much like the Republicans. The Republican campaign opposed participation in foreign wars and urged for a strong national defense, lower government spending, and a diluted concentration of power in the executive branch, the last of which is a direct criticism of Roosevelt's previous term. Willkie was a sort of dark horse candidate and came somewhat out of nowhere. He was also at a disadvantage because Roosevelt, as sitting president, could campaign with actions, such as giving weapons and supplies to Britain and making trade deals, in a way that Willkie could not. Most newspapers seemed to favor Willkie during the election, even the ones that had previously been pro-Roosevelt. The winner, however, was President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Vice President Henry A. Wallace. Voter turnout in this election was 58.8% of the voting age population, which is a slight increase from the previous election. The election of 1944 saw incumbent President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat, versus Thomas E. Dewey, a Republican. The Democratic campaign focused on dominant issues that had to do with the aftermath of World War II, such as the prosecution of war criminals, establishment and preservation of world peace, and they favored the creation of the United Nations, a just and punitive prosecution for the war. Roosevelt was pretty much doing okay for all three of his terms and had met with weak opposition from the Republican Party, so the odds were in his favor as he campaigned for a fourth. However, Dewey proved to be a strong opponent, and Roosevelt ended up campaigning hard for his re-election, delivering several political addresses and touring across the entire country. The Republican campaign, on the other side, favored the creation of the United Nations and strengthening of the U.S. military. Dewey stressed that Germany and Japan were not completely defeated and defensive measures needed to be taken. They criticized Roosevelt's involvement in the national debt that followed World War II. They stressed it was time for a change, which, following a war, is not exactly what the public was looking for at the time. This led to the president being Franklin D. Roosevelt and Vice President Harry S. Truman. Voter turnout in this election was 56.1%. a slight decrease from the previous election. The election of 1948 saw Harry S. Truman, a Democrat, campaigning against Thomas E. Dewey, a Republican, and J. Strom Thurmond, a states' rights Democrat. On the Democratic side, Truman had been serving as president since Roosevelt's death in 1945. Although he had successfully closed out World War II, his popularity and the popularity of the Democratic Party had been on a steady decline. Everyone thought he was unlikely to win. Truman, however, was confident in his abilities and campaigned hard across the country. He had whistle-stop tours, he gave 300 speeches in 250 cities, and this got voters very excited. The Republicans were doing well, having swept Congress in 1946, and were poised to take advantage of Truman's post-war unpopularity. The polls uniformly predicted Dewey's victory. However, while Truman was fighting for his votes all over the country, Dewey chose a more moderate stance and made no major efforts to excite U.S. voters. This led to the winner being Harry S. Truman and Vice President Alben W. Barkley. In this election, the voter turnout was 51.1%, a very slight decrease from the previous year. Over the course of World War II, it stayed much more consistent than in World War I. One possible explanation is the attitude of Americans after each war. After World War I, Americans were more isolationist, whereas after World War II, the attitude was kept up, instead shifting the war mentality towards the fight against communism. This is reflected in the voter turnouts. During World War I, the voter turnouts fluctuated greatly election to election, whereas in World War II, they stayed generally very consistent. In conclusion, at first glance, it's tempting to conclude that voters lean Democratic during wartime, and this does seem to ring true in the data. However, this is partially due to era-specific division in the Republican Party, which almost always stems from inner disagreements and lack of cohesion around presidential candidates. But I also think that it's mainly due to the fact that the incumbent candidate just happened to be a Democrat during the two world wars. The only Republican winner on this list is Warren G. Harding, and he competed in the only race in which none of the nominees had participated in the previous presidential administration. He's also notable for stressing the idea of a return to normal. This suggests that people gravitate away from the unknown during times of economic and political strife. This is indicative of a wider political conclusion, which is that pathos often rules presidential elections when it comes to the decisions of the American public. Policy often takes a backseat to the more primal desire to maintain a way of life and feel safe.
Our third and final sponsor for today's episode is the Radford Squirrels, who would like us to know that they do not abide by the tawdry laws of man, and that one day they will bury us all. Long live the squirrel god.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Smash the like and subscribe button right now. Please do it. We'll continue to make more until the end of Governor's School, which is in 2 days. Thank you. Goodbye.